down towards the end, but we're still excited, and we turn the page to Leviticus. And then it starts getting hard because it's just rules and regulations. It's just verses about don't cook a goat with a young goat in its mother's milk, and these are the clothing you can wear, and these are the people you can spend with, and this is the food you kind of eat. And then when you turn to Numbers, there's a few more stories, but still more rules, more regulations. Do we really need all this about the tabernacle and the priest? And well, it gets easier just to either skip ahead or skip doing it. So why is it in the book? Why do we have books dedicated to all these rules and regulation? The two books, Leviticus and Numbers, are interestingly named. Leviticus comes from the idea of from the Levites, because a lot of the rules pertain to the Levites, but not all. The book of Numbers is called Numbers in our English Bible simply because it starts with a census. It's no more complicated than that. The census is the first thing, and you number people, and it's numbers. But it's interesting because in the original Hebrew version, the title is In the Wilderness, which is a much more apropos title. Leviticus and Numbers deal with the people of Israel after they have come out of captivity and when they receive the law. It is the rules and regulations that were passed down. It was beyond the 10 Commandments that they were given from the Lord. It is how they got from Egypt to the Promised Land. And it tells a story. But for many of us, as we read these things, it's hard for us. So why is this in the Bible? Well, specifically put, you could probably sum up all the books with one verse from Leviticus 11:45. For I am the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt to be your God. You shall be holy, for I am holy. You see, these books are taking a people who were a slave tribe with no leadership to becoming the people of God. They were going to live in the presence of God Almighty. And to do so, they had to be a holy people, a set-apart people, a special and unique people. And the rules and the regulations of Leviticus and Numbers are how those people were supposed to behave. It's what was going to set them apart and make them a holy people. As you read through the book, you're going to notice several different categories. Now, the order of the book sometimes throws people off because it just seems to be various rules thrown here and about. If you went to Library of Congress and read all the rules that were passed, it might seem the same way, even though certain issues were going on, things get passed and they all just get grouped together. But you can see certain patterns emerging, certain types of laws that come through the book. You see a lot of things about offerings, the various offerings that were required by God, by the people. Not just the main big offerings, the sacrifice for sin and atonement, but also other offerings, grain offerings, peace offerings, different offerings that were given as a way to not only show their reverence to God, but provide for the priests and Levites. You also see the duties and the laws for the priests and the Levites. God demanded the firstborn. The firstborn was to be given to him. So what the method that was used there is the Levites were in essence the designated firstborn. Like you think of in baseball, the designated hitter, right? He goes up to hit for the pitcher. Well, the Levites were the designated firstborn. They represented the people that were given to God. And their lives were about his service. They wouldn't receive land in the promised land, but rather they would be among every tribe serving God as priests, serving God as Levites. You also see the festivals and holidays. For the Israelites, every time they would turn the calendar, every few months, there would be some feast, some remembrance, something that would remind them of God. Things like the Passover, the Feast of Booths, where they would remember where they came from and go out and spend the night in booths. Various festivals and things that reminded them they were the people of God. Just like today, we think of different holidays that remind us of the freedom that we have, or to celebrate those who served, or maybe even the workers of our society. They had their holidays to remind them of their relationship to God. But it wasn't just about the things that set up their society. It went down to the very way that they went about their business. This was a few million people possibly walking through the desert. And to get that many people anywhere, you had to know where to go. And God set up their camp that every day they would travel in a certain way, a certain distance, and every time they stopped, they would set themselves in a certain way. It is an amazing bit of logistics. In fact, when you look at the book of Leviticus and things that we may just completely dismiss were actually amazingly innovative for their day. Before great nations understood the need for setting up your camp in a certain way every time so you would know everything was, they were doing it with Leviticus. Before armies realized that if they didn't take care of their sanitation issues, it would cause uncleanliness, something human beings didn't really figure out until the 1800s. The book of Leviticus tells them exactly what to do, where to go, and what to do with it. God set it up for them to be able to travel this way and do these things. It also includes health and safety measures. How would they deal with outbreaks of disease? How would they deal with certain issues that would come up? You know, before anyone understood the need to quarantine sick people, the book of Leviticus would set those outside of the camp. As we see, God seemed to know a little bit more about how things work than the ancient people did. But it wasn't just about the physical, it was also about the spiritual. Rules regulating holiness. The idea that the people would be set apart. That would go not just in one aspect of their life to every aspect of life. You look at the ancient laws of mankind during those days, the different covenants, the different rule sets that were created. And most of them had to deal with laws that said don't steal from somebody else, right? To keep people at peace. But God demanded a higher standard. Most rules didn't care about who you married or who you had sexual relations with, but God very much did. And they were clearly spelled out. It spelled out these interactions in a way of two states. Cleanliness and uncleanliness. Cleanliness was something that you desired to be, but you couldn't avoid. Sometimes certain aspects of life would make you unclean, and it would take time before you could set yourself right again. But this idea of cleanliness was one that set a standard for the people of God. If they were going to live among a holy God, they had to do certain things to make sure they were clean and holy before Him. And sometimes when we read these regulations, especially when they come to things like food, which animal is clean and you can eat, which animal is unclean and you can't eat, it seems very odd to us. And scholars over the years have debated why. Why did God choose these things and those things? Why was this animal clean and this animal was unclean? Well, some things we look at and say, well, that was probably a smart thing because we know that certain animals tend to have more diseases. You know, pigs were unclean. And we eat pigs all the time today, but in the ancient world, it's a lot more dangerous. Pigs are a very good transmitter of disease to humans because, unfortunately, we're a lot physically alike. Not eating pork would have been a pretty good safe bet in that day and age without refrigeration and proper cooking. But it's more than that. It's about God setting a standard and saying, here's what I want you to do. And sometimes that standard is just arbitrary. God says, do this and not that. And they were to do this and not that in order to maintain that cleanliness. If you're going to live with God Almighty, you better know the rules. Maybe we think about that today. If we were going to transport a radioactive substance, right? We wouldn't just walk out the car, throw it in the back seat, and take off. Right? If we had precious cargo, what would we do? We'd want to, keep it safe, right? There'd be certain things we'd have to do. But if you're going to live in the presence of God, if God was going to be among you, then you had to do everything you can to make sure you were right by Him. These laws had a purpose. What was it? Why? Why all the rules and regulations? And maybe even more so, why do we need to know them? Well, because of them, they set certain principles. For example, they set the need of sacrifice. When you read through these books, you're going to see a lot about sacrifices. A large percentage of the Israelite economy went up in smoke every year. The very animals, the best of their flock, would not be bred to create more. They would be burned up in these sacrifices. Why? Because God had to let his people know that sin came at a cost. In Leviticus chapter 17, verse 11, it says, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your souls. It is by the blood, by reason of life, that makes atonement." God said there had to be blood shed. Why? Because it was the only thing that could make atonement. Atonement literally means payment substitution. It means you can't pay this, so you have to find something to substitute for it. And God said sin is so costly, the only thing that can sub for it is the blood, the very life itself. And these sacrifices helped Israel understand how dangerous sin was. It wasn't something you could just buy off with a few coins. Rather, life had to be taken. It also teaches the need for reverence. As we said earlier, these people are going to be in the presence of God. We see that dramatically told in a narrative form in Leviticus chapter 10. When two of the sons of Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, went before God to offer their sacrifice, the fire pans, the incense that were offered daily to God. But when they did so, it said they did it with strange fire. What does that mean? Well, they did it in a way that God hadn't told them to. And in doing so, it showed an irreverence to God, and they paid for it with their very lives. But not only did they pay for it with their very lives, Aaron himself was not even allowed to mourn for his sons. An act that God deemed heinous was what? Just not following what he had told them to do. It showed them that God demanded the reverence that was due to him. "For those who come near, I will be treated as holy. Before all the people, I will be honored." If his very representatives couldn't give him the honor that was due him, how could he expect his people to? So God set a very harsh precedent to show the people of Israel the need of reverence. God was to be first in their lives in everything, not just their worship, but the very clothes they wore, the food that they ate, were set apart before God. It also shows that need of commitment. You see, to live a life from the book of Leviticus was not something you could do haphazardly or without much effort. You know, some religions, it's not hard to follow, right? Maybe you make a one-time commitment and then that's about it. Nothing much is expected of you. Okay, maybe once or twice a year you have to go and do something, but God's people were put on a different schedule. It's interesting in Leviticus chapter 23 when he starts to talk about the various holy days, he says it this way: "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, the Lord's appointed times which you shall proclaim a holy convocation. My appointed times are these." God says, this is my time. That phrase there, that holy convocation, in the original Hebrew means to be called out. It's the same term that we apply in the New Testament to the church, the same verbiage, right? An assembly, a coming together. God said, you're going to come together as my people, and you're going to do it on my schedule. You couldn't just give God his due and then forget about him for a long period of time. No, time and time again, that reminder would become of your relationship to God. It set up a need of commitment. But what we also see in these books is not just God's standard, but we also see their rebellion. Because you can't help but, as you read through these books, see over and over again how much rebellion there is against God. For a people whom God has saved from bondage, they sure don't seem to appreciate it much. They don't appreciate their leader Moses and what he did. Over and over again, we see the various people that should be leading them and helping them turning against them. We see the priests like Nadab and Abihu going before God irreverently. Rebellion. We see even Moses' own family, Aaron and Miriam, speaking out against him. God having to stand up and for stand up for Moses and harm with leprosy those two. We see the Levites and the rebellion of Korah. Well, they say, well, why does Moses think he's so special? We're all special. God deals with them by opening up the ground and swallowing them whole, saying if something bad happened to them that was just normal, you might not think it was for God. God said, I'm going to do something so dramatic, you'll know what I'm doing to these rebels. We see it with the spies. The top and the best that were sent in to spy out their land, but their report is basically the land is good, but we can't take it. They forget about what God will do for them. Only 2 of them stand up. And because of that, the whole congregation rebels and ends up wandering for 40 years because of it. We see it with people like Balaam, an outsider who worshiped the true living God, who understood God, but still was willing to sell them out. And we see it with Balaam's advice to the people. Hey, you can't get God to turn against them, but you can get them to turn against God. Invite them to your feast. Invite them to come and worship and play with you, and they'll give up their God like that, which they do. And another rebellion breaks out. But it's not only these big, direct rebellions. Probably the biggest rebellion we see is the subtle rebellion of complaining. At least 10 different times throughout this book, we see a statement that the people grumbled. They complained. God gave them food to eat that they just had to literally walk up and pick up off the ground, but it wasn't good enough. He gives them quail to eat, they complain. Anytime they needed it, God provided water for them, but it was never enough. They were always complaining about it. They were always longing to go back to Egypt. Oh, think of the good food that was there, but they forgot that they were slaves. Over and over again, they complained. My favorite complaint is in Numbers chapter 21 and verse 5. It says, the people spoke against God and Moses. Why have you brought us out of the land of Egypt to die in the wilderness? There's no food and water, and we loathe this miserable food. Do you realize the contradiction there? We have absolutely nothing to eat, and it's terrible. Well, if you have absolutely nothing to eat, it wouldn't be terrible food. You can complain about the terrible food, or you can complain about the lack of food, but you can't complain about both, but they sure did. Didn't matter what you did, they were going to complain about it. They were going to find some fault. They were going to murmur. They were going to cause trouble. You know, it's funny because sometimes they're real complaints, right? There's worries, there's concern, and sometimes there's just the silly, stupid things. But in the end, neither one makes any difference, because if you do that, what you're really doing is turning against the Lord. That's what they did. Their rebellion was in the form of complaining. Numbers chapter 11 verse 1, in one of their complaints, it says, now the people became like those who complain of adversity in the hearing of the Lord, and when the Lord heard of it, his anger was kindled, and the fire of the Lord burned against them and consumed some of them on the outskirts of the camp. I've always thought that was unusual phrasing there. Who complain about adversity in the hearing of the Lord. You know, sometimes we complain about something, but we wait until we get home and we're by ourselves and we grumble a little bit. Oh, I didn't like that, because we didn't want anybody to hear us. But sometimes we complain just so loud enough and just off enough that we don't really intend people to hear it, but we're not so mad that they overheard it. That's kind of how they were with God. They didn't even respect him enough to walk out of his presence before they started complaining, murmuring, causing problems. And over we see the same thing. Their rebellion leads to their destruction. Their complaining leads to a separation. God's anger burns against them. They're punished time and time again, but they never seem to stop. No matter how much it hurts them, they keep falling into the same bad habits. Holy God giving clear commands, yet his people can't seem to follow them. Why do we need these books? It's simple. Because it's telling us about us. Paul in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 11 says, I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that our forefathers were all under the cloud and passed through the sea. They were all baptized into Moses in the cloud and into the sea. We all ate the same spiritual food. We all drank the same spiritual drink. And they were drinking from a spiritual rock which followed them, and that rock was Christ. Nevertheless, with most of them, God was not well pleased, and they were laid low in the wilderness. Paul says when we look at them and we see them wandering around in the wilderness, and God providing food for them, God providing drink for them, but yet they turned against him. He's pointing and saying, that's us today. That's the church. We're a spiritual people that have been led out of bondage. We're people that are being trying to be taken to the promised land. We're people whom God has said, here's what I need you to be. And yet, just like them, we fall into the same mistakes. What did they do? Continue on. Now these things happened as examples for us, so we not crave the evil so they crave. Do not be idolaters, as is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and stood up to play. Neither let us act immorally as some of them did, and 23,000 fell in one day. Let us not try the Lord as some of them did, and were destroyed with serpents, nor grumble as some of them did, and they were destroyed by the destroyer. Now these things happened as an example, and they were written for our instruction, for whom the end of the ages have come. He said they're not much different than us. The rock that they drank from was Christ. And if we're not careful, we can be not much different than them by following into the same traps. He said they turned to idolatry. How did they turn to idolatry? Because they were more interested in what would bring them pleasure and happiness than they were about serving God. Today, do we put our pleasure, our desires, our wants as the God that we chase and serve more than the true God? I can't serve God because I've got to make money. I've got to get more things. Do we turn against God as immoral people? Do we allow God's standard not to be our standard? Where God says, I need you to be a holy people. And he tells us we need to be a holy people, but yet we sit there and think we can just tolerate sin? Do we try the Lord as they did? Demanding God give and give and give. And when he doesn't, they turned against him. Do we grumble? Do we grumble? Never satisfied, always finding fault. Always complaining about something. These things happened as an example. If we miss these books, we miss the best example of what we shouldn't be. We miss an understanding that God is holy. God is special. You don't just walk up to God and expect him to deliver things for you. Then you miss the true nature of God. He's the creator of the universe. He's the Almighty. The fact that he would even have anything to do with us should make us fall down in reverence before him. But yet, how do we treat God? Like a great big vending machine in the sky. Give me what I want. Like someone who we can give his due certain times and then leave us alone for the rest of it. We'll show up on a few days of the month. We show up a few times of the year. We'll claim ourselves to follow him, but everything in our life says something different. We're not much different than those around us. I once heard it said, they said, when we as the God's people, this is the closest to hell that we will ever be. But for the rest of the world, this life is the closest to heaven that they'll ever be. What's it like to live in the presence of God? You know, we go through a lot of pain and suffering in this world. The Israelites went through pain and suffering. I'm sure wandering in the desert was not a fun thing to do. But did God ever forsake them? Did God ever leave them without? Oh, sure, they were worried they weren't going to have any water. They were sure worried about the food, but every time God delivered, yet they still failed to trust him. And because of that, so many of them fell before they got to the end. A whole generation had to pass away before they walked into the promised land. Why? Because they rebelled, because they turned against God. The Hebrew writer says it this way in Hebrews chapter 3, verses 9 through 13, where your fathers tried me by testing me and saw my works for 40 years. Therefore I was angry with this generation and said, I will always go astray in their hearts. And they did not know my ways. And I swore in my wrath, they shall not enter my rest. Take care, brethren, that there not be any of you that has an evil, unbelieving heart that falls away from the living God, but encourage one another day after day, as long as it's still called a day, so that none of you will be hardened by the deceitfulness of sin. If Leviticus and Numbers teach us anything, it's the very real danger of sin. They teach us that God is holy. They teach us that there is a promised reward waiting, but if we are unfaithful, if we try Him, if we test Him, if we turn from Him, we won't have that reward. Don't make the mistakes that they made. Don't fall into the traps that they made. Learn from the example. Because God was never more clear than He was with the Israelites. And they were never more rebellious. That's why we need to not make the mistake that they made. Listen and be obedient to God and His commands. Many people want to find their way to heaven. They want to find a place with God, but they can't ever really bother to figure out what God wants from them. And God is clear. His Son spoke to us about what we must do to be His child, to be right with Him, to find that reward. He gave us one to follow, His Son, one to believe Him. He gave us a way to walk. And when we find ourselves the wrong way, He tells us to change, to repent, to turn around. He commands us to make a confession, to make a commitment, to declare Jesus as Lord. And He tells us that we have to be cleansed. The means that He gave us is the same means He gave them, by blood. The blood that we come in contact with when we're baptized into Christ, because one had to shed His blood for forgiveness. How could we say then we don't need to be baptized? What we're really saying then is we don't really need Christ. We don't need the blood. We don't need forgiveness. Are we walking the path as we should walk? Are we following the example of the Israelites of old, or are we seeking a new way? Are we more interested in complaining and grumbling and trying and testing? Are we like the leaders in the rebellion that were more interested in getting their due, getting their elevation up, instead of humbly committing to follow God and His plan? Maybe we're making the same mistakes we did, but we have a chance to set right. They didn't get to enter the rest, but that doesn't mean that you can't. But you can only do that if you come back to Him. Tonight, if you're subject to the invitation, tonight if you need to put Christ on in baptism, tonight if you need the prayers of your congregation, we invite you to come right now while we stand and sing. Walk with the Lord in the light.